The Devil Rides Out by Dennis Wheatley. Author's Note. I desire to state that I, personally, have never assisted at or participated in any ceremony connected with magic, black or white. The literature of occultism is so immense that any con- conscious writer can obtain from it abundant material for the background of a romance such as this. In the present case, I have spared no pains to secure accuracy of detail from existing accounts when describing magical rites or formulas for protection against evil, and these have been verified in conversation with certain persons, sought out for that purpose, who are actual practitioners of the art. All the characters and situations in this book are entirely imaginary, but in the inquiry necessary to the writing of it, I found ample evidence that black magic is still practiced in London and other cities at the present day. Should any of my readers incline to a serious study of the subject, and thus come into contact with a man or woman of power, I feel that it is only right to urge them most strongly to refrain from being drawn into the practice of the secret art in any way. My own observations have led me to an absolute conviction that to do so would bring them into the dangers of a very real and concrete nature. Dennis Wheatley. Chapter 1. The Incomplete Reunion. The Duc de Richelieu and Rex Van Ryn had gone into dinner at 8 o'clock, but coffee was not served till after 10. An appetite in keeping with his mighty frame had enabled Van Ryn to do ample justice to each well-chosen course, and as was his custom each time the young American arrived in England, the Duke had produced his finest wines for this their reunion dinner at his flat. A casual observer might well have considered it a strange friendship, but despite their difference in age and race, appearance and tradition, a real devotion existed between the two. Some few years earlier, Rex's foolhardiness had landed him in a Soviet prison, and the elderly French exile had put aside his peaceful existence as art connoisseur and dilettante and searched for him in Russia. Together they had learned the dangerous secret of the Forbidden Territory, and traveled many thousand versts pursued by the merciless agents of the Ukpu. There had been others, too, in their strange adventure, young Richard Eaton, and the little Princess Marie Lou, whom he had brought out of Russia as his bride. But as Rex accepted a long Hoyo de Monterey from the cedar cabinet which the Duke's man presented to him, his thoughts were not on the Eatons at all, living now so happily with their little daughter Fleur in their in their lovely old country home near Kidderminster. He was thinking of that third companion, whose subtle brain and shy, nervous courage had proved so great an aid when they were hunted like hares through the length and breadth of Russia, the frail, narrow-shouldered English Jew, Simon Aaron. What could possibly have kept Simon from being with them tonight? Rex was wondering. He had never failed before to make a third at these reunion dinners, and why had the Duke brushed aside his inquiries about him in such an offhand manner? There was something queer about de Richelieu's reticence, and Rex had a feeling that for all his host's easy charm and bland, witty conversation, something had gone seriously wrong. He slowly revolved some of the Duke's wonderful old brandy in a bowl-shaped glass, while he watched the servant preparing to leave the room. Then, as the door closed, he set it down and addressed de Richelieu almost abruptly. "Well, I'm thinking it's about time for you to spill the beans." The Duke inhaled the first cloud of fragrant smoke from another of those long hoyos which were his especial pride, and answered guardedly, Have you not seen? Have you not better tell me, Rex, to what particular beans you refer?" "Simon, of course. For years now the three of us have dined together on our first night. Each time I've come across the pod, and you were too mighty casual to be natural when I asked about him before dinner. Why isn't he here?" Why, and indeed, my friend, the Duke repeated, running the tips of his fingers down his lean, handsome face. I asked him, and told him that your ship docked this morning, but he declined to honor us tonight. Well, is he ill then? No. As far as I know, he's perfectly well. At all events, he was at his office today. Well, he must have had a date, then he couldn't scrap, or some mighty urgent work. Nothing less could induce him to let us down on one of these occasions. They've become, well, in a way, almost sacred to our friendship. On the contrary, he is at home alone tonight. He made his apologies, of course. Something about resting for a bridge tournament that starts. Oh, bridge tournament, my foot! Exclaimed Rex angrily. He'd, he'd never let that interfere between us three. It sounds mighty fishy to me. When did you see him last? Oh, about 3 months ago. What? Well, that's incredible. Now look here. Rex thrust the onyx ashtray from in front of him and leaned across the table. You haven't quarreled, have you? De Richelieu shook his head. If you were my age, Rex, and had no children, then met two younger men who gave you their affection, and had all the attributes which you could wish for in your own sons, how would it be possible for you to quarrel with either of them? Well, that's so, but 3 months is a whale of a while for friends who are accustomed to meet 2 or 3 times a week. I just don't get this thing at all. And you're being a slight too reticent about it. Come on now, what do you know? The gray eyes of piercing brilliance which gave such character to Richelieu's face lit up. That, he said, suddenly, is just the trouble. I don't know anything. But you fear that, to use his own phrase, Simon's in a muddle. A really nasty muddle, eh? And you're a little hurt that he hasn't brought his worry to you. To whom should he turn, if not to one of us? And you are in the States. Well, Richard, maybe. He's an even older friend of Simon's than we are. No. I spent last week at Cardinal's Folly, and neither Richard nor Marie Lou could tell me anything. They haven't seen him since he went down to stay last Christmas and arrived with a dozen crates of toys for Fleur. How like him? Rex's gargantuan laugh rang suddenly through the room. I might have known the trunkful I brought over would be small fry if you and Simon had been busy on that child. Well, I could have only concluded that poor Simon is in a muddle, as you say, or he would have never treated us like this. Well, what sort of muddle? Rex brought his leg of mutton fist crashing down on the table angrily. I can't think of a thing where he wouldn't turn to us. Money, suggested the Duke, is the one thing that his queer, sensitive nature he might not care to discuss with even his closest friends. I doubt it being that. My old man has a wonderful opinion of Simon's financial ability, and he handles a big portion of our interests on the side. I'm pretty sure we'd be wise to it if he'd burned his fingers on the market. It sounds as if he'd gone bats about some woman to me. De Richelieu's face was lit by his faintly cynical smile for a moment. No, he said slowly. A man in love turns naturally to his friends for congratulation or sympathy, as his fortune with a woman proves good or ill. It can't be that. For a little the two friends sat staring at each other in silence across the low jade bowl, with his trailing sprays of orchids. Rex, giant-shouldered, virile, and powerful, his ugly, attractive, humorous young face clouded with anxiety. The Duke, a slim, delicate-looking man, somewhat about middle height, with slender, fragile hands and graying hair, but with no trace of weakness in his fine, distinguished face. His aquiline nose, broad forehead, and gray devil's eyebrows might have well replaced those of the Cavalier Van Dyck that gazed down from the opposite wall. Instead of the conventional black, he wore a claret-colored vicuna smoking suit with silk lapels and braided fastenings. This touch of color increased his likeness to the portrait. He broke the silence suddenly. Have you by any chance heard of a Mr. Mokata, Rex? No. Who is he, anyway? A new friend of Simon's, who has been staying with him these last few months. What? At his club? No, no, Simon no longer lives at his club. I thought you knew. He bought a house last February, a big rambling old place tucked away at the end of the cul-de-sac of one of those, quiet residential streets in St. John's Wood. Why, that's right out of Regent's Park, isn't it? What's he want with a place out there, and when there are any number of nice little houses to let here in Mayfair? Another mystery, my friend. The Duke's thin lips creased into a smile. He said he wanted a garden. That's all I can tell you. Simon, a garden? That's a good story, Elsie. Simon doesn't know a geranium from a fuchsia, whatever the hell that is. His botany is limited to an outsized florist bill for bunching his women friends from shops. And why should he, a bachelor like Simon, start running a big house at all? Well, perhaps Mr. Makata could tell you, murmured Duke Richelieu. Gosh. Or the queer servant that he has imported. Have you ever seen this bird? Makata, I mean. Yes, I called one evening about 6 weeks ago. Simon was out, so Makata received me. And what did you make of him? Well, I disliked him intensely. He's a pot-bellied, bald-headed person of about 60, with large, protuberant, fishy eyes, limp hands, and a most unattractive lisp. He reminded me of a large white slug. What about the servant that you mentioned? I only saw him for a moment, when he crossed the hall, but he reminded me in a most unpleasant way of the bogeyman, with whom I used to be threatened in my infancy. Why, is he a black? Yes, a Malagasy, I should think. Rex frowned. Now, what the hell is that? A native of Madagascar. They are a curious people, half Negro, half Polynesian. This great brute stands about 6'8", and the one glimpse I had of his eyes made me want to shoot him on sight. He's a bad black, if I ever saw one. And I've traveled, as you know, in my time. Well, do you know any more about these people? Asked Rex grimly. Not a thing. Well, I'm not given to worry, but I've heard quite enough to get me scared for Simon. He's in some jam, or he'd never be housing people like that. The Duke gently laid the long blue-gray ash of his cigar in the onyx ashtray. There is not a doubt, he said slowly, that Simon is involved in some very queer business. But I have been stifling my anxiety until your arrival. You see, I wanted to hear your views before taking the very exceptional step of, yes, butting in is the expression, on the private affairs of even so intimate a friend. The question is now, what are we to do? Do? Rex thrust his chair back and drew himself up to his full, magnificent height. We're going up to that house to have a little heart-to-heart talk with Simon. Right now. I'm glad, said de Richelieu, quietly. You feel like that because I ordered the car for 10:30. Shall we go? Chapter 2. The Curious Guests of Mr. Simon Aaron. As de Richelieu's Hispano drew up at the dead end of the dark cul-de-sac in St. John's Wood, Rex slipped out of the car and looked about him. They were shut in by the high walls of neighboring gardens, and above a blank expanse of brick in which a single narrow door was visible, the upper stories of Simon's house showed vague and mysterious among whispering trees. Ugh, he exclaimed with a little shudder as a few drops splashed upon his face from the dark branches overhead. What a dismal hole! We might be in a graveyard. The Duke pressed the bell, and turning up the sable collar of his coat against a slight drizzle which made the April night seem chill and friendless, stepped back to get a better view of the premises. Hello? Hello. Simon's got an observatory here, he remarked. I didn't notice that on my previous visit. So he has. Rex followed de Richelieu's glance to a dome that crowned the house, but at the moment an electric globe suddenly flared into life above their heads, and the door in the wall swung open, disclosing a sallow-faced manservant in dark livery. Mr. Simon Aaron? Inquired de Richelieu, but the man was already motioning them to enter, so they followed him up a short, covered path and the door in the wall clanged to behind them. The vestibule of the house was dimly lit, but Rex, who never wore a coat or hat in the evening, noticed that the two sets of outdoor apparel lay neatly folded on a long console table as the silent footman relieved de Richelieu of his wraps. Evidently, friend Simon had other visitors. Maybe Mr. Aaron's in conference and won't want to be disturbed, he said to the sallow-faced servant with a sudden feeling of guilt at their intrusion. Perhaps, after all, their fears for Simon were quite groundless, and his neglect only due to a prolonged period of intense activity on the markets, but the man only bowed and led them across the hall. The fellow's a mute, whispered Duke. Deaf and dumb, I'm certain. As he spoke, the servant flung open a couple of large double doors and stood waiting for them to enter. A long, narrow room, opening into a wide salon, stretched before them. Both were decorated in the lavish magnificence of the Louis XVI period, but for the moment of the dazzling brilliance of the lighting prevented them taking in the details of the parquet floors, the crystal mirrors, the gilded furniture, and beautifully wrought tapestries. Rex was the first to recover, and with a quick intake of breath, he clutched de Richelieu's arm. By Jove, she's here, he muttered, almost inaudibly, his eyes riveted on a tall, graceful girl who stood some yards away at the entrance of the salon, talking to Simon. 3 times in the last 18 months he had chanced upon that strange, wise, beautiful face, with the deep eyes beneath heavy lids that seemed so full of secrets, and gave the lovely face a curiously ageless look, so that despite her apparent youth, she was as old as— Yes, as old as sin, Rex caught himself thinking. He had seen her first in a restaurant in Budapest, months later again in a traffic jam when his car wedged beside hers in New York, and then, strangely enough, riding alongside a road with 3 men in the country 10 miles outside of Buenos Aires. How extraordinary that he should find her here! And what luck! He smiled quickly at the thought that Simon could not fail to introduce him. De Richelieu's glance was riveted upon their friend. With an abrupt movement, Simon turned towards them. For a second he seemed completely at a loss. His full, sensual mouth hung open to twice its normal extent, and his receding jaw almost disappeared behind his white tie, while his dark eyes were filled with amazement and suddenly suspiciously like fear. But he recovered almost instantly, and his old smile flashed out as he came forward to greet them. My dear Simon, the Duke's voice was a silky purr. How can we apologize for breaking in on you like this? Sure, he hadn't a notion you were throwing a party, boomed Rex, his glance following the girl, who had moved off to join another woman and 3 men who were talking together in the inner room. But I'm delighted, murmured Simon genially. Delighted to see you both. Only got a few friends meeting of a little society I belong to. That's all. Then we couldn't dream of interrupting you, could we, Rex? De Richelieu demurred as well-assumed innocence. Well, certainly not. We wouldn't have even come, and if that servant of yours hadn't taken us for some other folks you're expecting. But despite their apparent unwillingness to intrude, neither of the two made any gesture of withdrawal, and mentally de Richelieu and gave Simon full marks for the way in which he accepted their obviously unwelcome presence. I'm most terribly sorry about dinner tonight, he was proclaiming earnestly. Meant to rest for my bridge. I simply have to these days to be any good. You even forgot till 6 o'clock that I had these people coming. How fortunate of you, for you, Simon, that your larder is so well stocked. The Duke could not resist the gentle dig as his glance fell on a long buffet spread with a collation which would have rivaled the cold table in any great hotel. I phoned Ferraro, parried Simon glibly. The Berkeley never lets me down. Would have asked you to drop in, but with this meeting on, I felt you'd be bored. Bored? Not a bit. We are keeping you from your other guests, aired Rex when he waved his hand in the direction of the inner room. Sure. As he laid a large hand on Simon's arm and gently propelled him towards the Salon. Don't you worry about us. We'll just take a glass of wine, a view, and fade away. His eyes were fixed again on the pale oval face of the girl. Simon's glance flickered swiftly towards the Duke, who ignored with a guileless smile his obvious reluctance for them to meet his other friends, and noted with amusement that he avoided any proper introduction. Er, er, um, "To very old friends of mine," he said with his little nervous cough as he interchanged a swift look with a fleshy moon-faced man de Richelieu knew to be Mokata. "Well, well, how nice," the bald man lisped. I guess he. Well, I can't do a lisp. With unsmiling eyes. "It is a pleasure to always welcome any friends of Simon's." That's a good voice. De Richelieu gave him a frigid bow and thought of reminding him coldly that Simon's welcome was sufficient in his own house, but for the moment it was policy to hide his antagonism. So he replied politely that Makata was most kind. Then, with the ease which characterized all his movements, he turned his attention to an elderly lady who was seated nearby. She was a woman of advanced age, but fine presence, richly dressed and almost weighed down with heavy jewelry. Between her fingers, which she held the stub of a fat cigar, which she was puffing vigorously. "Madam," the Duke drew a case containing the long hoyos from his pocket and bent towards her. "Your cigar is almost finished. Permit me to offer you one of mine." She regarded him for a moment with piercingly bright eyes, then stretched out a fat, beringed hand. "Thank you, monsieur. I see you are a connoisseur." With her beaked parrot nose, she sniffed at the cigar appreciatively. "I have not seen you at other meetings. What is your name?" "De Richelieu, madam. And yours?" "Ah, de Richelieu, a maestro indeed." She nodded heavily. "Je suis Madame Durfray. You will have me?" "Oh, but certainly." The Duke bowed again. "Do you think we shall have a good meeting tonight?" "If the sky clears, we shall learn much," she answered the old lady cryptically, or answered the old lady cryptically. "Ho, ho!" thought the Duke. "We are about to make use of Simon's observatory, it seems. Good, let us learn more." But before he could pump the elderly Frenchwoman further, Simon deftly interrupted the conversation and drew him away. "So, you have taken up the study of the stars, my friend," remarked the Duke as his host led him to the buffet. "Oh, yeah, yes, I find astronomy very interesting. You know, have some caviar." Simon's eyes flickered anxiously towards Rex, who was deep in conversation with the girl. As he admired her burnished hair and slumberous eyes, for a moment the Duke was reminded of a Botticelli painting. She had, he thought, that angel look, with nothing Christian in it, peculiar to women born out of their time, the golden virgin to the outward eye, whose veins were filled with unlit fire, a rare Cinquecento type who should have lived in the Italy of Borgia. Then he turned again to Simon. "It was because of the observatory that you acquired this house, I suppose." Uh, yes. You must come up one night and we'll watch a few stars together." Something of the old warmth had crept into Simon's tone, and he was obviously in earnest as he offered the invitation, but the Duke was not deceived into believing that he was welcome on the present occasion. "Thank you. I should enjoy that," he said promptly, while over Simon's shoulder he studied the other two men who made up the party. One, a tall, fair fellow, stood talking to Makata, his thin, flaxen hair brushed lightly back, and whose queer light eyes proclaimed him an albino. The other, a stout man, dressed in a green plaid and ginger kilt, was walking softly up and down with hands clasped behind his back, muttering to himself audibly. His wild, flowing white hair and curious costume suggested an Irish bard. Altogether a most altogether a most unproposing lot. The hell does that mean? Thought the Duke, and his opinion was not improved by the three new arrivals, a grave-faced Chinaman wearing the robes of a mandarin, whose slit eyes betrayed a cold, merciless nature, and a Eurasian with only one arm, the left, and a tall, thin woman with a scraggy throat and beetling eyebrows which met across the bridge of her nose. Makata received them as though he were the host, but as the tall woman bore down on Simon, he promptly left the Duke, who guessed that the move was to get out of the earshot. However, the lady's greeting in a high pitched Middle Western accent came clearly to him. Well, Simon, all excitement about what we'll learn tonight. Oh, it should help a heap, that being your natal conjunction. Ha ha ha, said de Richelieu to himself. Now I begin to understand a little, and I like this part even less. Then, with the idea of trying to verify his surmise, he turned towards the one-armed Eurasian, but Simon, apparently guessing his intention, quickly excused himself to the American woman and cut off the Duke's advance. So, my young friend, thought de Richelieu, you mean to prevent me from obtaining any further information about this strange gathering, do you? All right, I'll twist your tail a little. And he remarked sweetly, did you say that you were interested in astronomy or astrology, Simon? There is a distinct difference, you know. Oh, astronomy, of course. Simon ran a finger down his long, beak-like nose. It is nice to see you again. Have some more champagne? Thank you, no, no. Later, perhaps, the Duke smothered a smile as he caught Makata, who had overheard him, exchange a quick look with Simon. I wish there was an ordinary meeting, Simon said a moment later with an uneasy frown. Then I'd ask you to stay, but we're going through the Society's annual balance sheet tonight, you know, and you and Rex, you know, not being members, you know. Quite, my dear fellow friend, of course, of course, de Richelieu agreed amicably, while to himself he thought, that's a nasty, fierce young sly boots that's put up for me. But I'll be damned if I go before I find out for certain what I came for. Then he added in a cheerful whisper, I should have gone before Rex seems interested in the young woman in green. I want to give him as long as possible. My dear chap, Simon protested, I feel horribly embarrassed at having to ask you to go at all. A fat, oily-looking baboo in a salmon-pink turban and gown had just arrived and was shaking hands with Makata. Behind him came a red-faced Teuton, who suffered the deformity of a hare lip. Simon stepped quickly forward again as the two advanced, but de Richelieu once more caught the first words, which were snuffed out by the hare-lipped man. Well, Abraham, wie Geist est? Then there came the fulsome chuckle of the fleshy Indian. You must not call him that. It is unlikely to do so before the great night. The devil it is, muttered the Duke to himself. But Simon had left the other two with almost indecent haste in order to rejoin him. So he said with a smile, I gather you are about to execute deed Paul, my friend. Simon exclaimed with a slight start. To change your name, de Richelieu supplemented. Nah. He shook his head rapidly as he uttered the curious negative he often used. It came of his saying no without troubling to close the lips of his full mouth. No, that's only a sort of joke we have between us, a sort of initiation ceremony. I'm not a full member yet. I see. Well, you have ceremonies in your astronomical society? How interesting. As he spoke, de Richelieu out of the corner of his eye saw Mokata make a quick sign to Simon, and then glance at the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece. So to save his host the awkwardness of having actually to request his departure, he exclaimed, Oh, dear me, 11:20. I had no idea it was so late. I must drag Rex away from that lovely lady after all, I fear. Well, if you must go. Simon looked embarrassed and worried, but catching Makata's eye again, he promptly led the way over to his other unwelcome guest. Rex gave a happy grin as they came up. Well, this is marvelous, Simon. I've been getting glimpses of this lady in different continents these 2 years past, and she seems to recall having seen me too. It's just great that we should become so acquainted at last through you. Then he smiled and quickly at the girl. May I present my friend de Richelieu? Duke, this is Miss Tanith. De Richelieu bent over her long, almost transparent hand and raised it to his lips. How unfortunate I am. he said with an old-fashioned gallantry, to be presented to you only in time to say goodbye, and perhaps gain your displeasure by taking your new friend with me as well. But she regarded him steadily out of large, clear amber eyes. Surely you must not depart before the ceremony. I fear we must. We are not members of your circle, you see, only old friends of Simon's. A strange look of annoyance and uncertainty crept into her glance, and the Duke guessed that she was searching her mind for any indiscretions that she might have committed in her conversation with Rex. Then she shrugged slightly, and, with a brief inclination of the head which dismissed them both, turned coldly away. The Duke took Simon's arm affectionately as the three friends left the salon. I wonder, he said persuasively, if you could spare me just 2 minutes before we go. No more, I promise you. Rather, of course. Simon seemed now to have regained his old joviality. Joviality? Whatever. I'll never forgive myself for missing your dinner tonight. This wretched meeting, you know. I've never seen nothing. I've seen nothing of you for weeks, and now Rex is over, and we must throw a party together. We will, de Richelieu agreed heartily. But listen, is not Mars in conjunction with Venus tonight? No, Simon replied promptly. With Saturn. That's what we've all come to see. Ah, Saturn. My astronomy is so rusty. But I saw some mention of it in the paper yesterday, and at one time I was a keen student of the stars. Would it be asking too much, my dear fellow, to have just one peep at it through your telescope? I mean, we should hardly delay your meeting for 5 minutes. Simon's hesitation was barely perceptible before he nodded his bird-like head with vigorous assent. Um, that's that's all right. They haven't all arrived yet. Let's go up. Then, with his hands thrust deep in the trouser pockets of his exceedingly well-cut dress suit, he led them hurriedly through the hall and up 3 flights of stairs. The Richelieu followed more slowly. Stairs were the one thing that which ruffled with his otherwise equable temper, and he had no desire to lose it now. By the time he arrived in the lofty chamber, and with Rex behind him, Simon had all the lights switched on. Well, you've certainly gone in for it properly, Rex remarked as he surveyed the powerful telescope slanting to the roof and a whole arsenal of sextants, spheres, and other astrological impedimenta, impedimenta ranged from the room. It's rather an exact science, you see, Simon volunteered. Quite, agreed the Duke briefly. But I wonder if, a little, that you should consider charts of the macrocosm necessary to your studies. Oh, those. Simon shrugged his narrow shoulders as he glanced around the walls. They're only for fun, you know. Relics of the alchemistic nonsense in the Middle Ages, you know, but quite suitable for decoration. How clever of you to carry out your scheme of decoration on the wall to the floor as well. The Duke was thoughtfully regarding a 5-pointed star, enclosed within 2 circles between which numerous mystic characters in Greek and Hebrew had been carefully drawn. Yes, a good idea, wasn't it? Simon tittered into his hand. It was the familiar gesture which both of his friends knew so well, yet somehow his chuckle had not quite its usual ring. The silence that followed was a little awkward, and in it all three plainly heard a muffled scratching noise that seemed to come from a large wicker basket placed against the wall. You've got mice here, Simon, said Rex casually, but de Richelieu had stiffened where he stood. Then, before Simon could bar his way, he leapt towards the hamper and ripped open the lid. Stop that! Cried Simon angrily, and dashing forward, he forced it shut again, but too late, for within the basket the Duke had seen 2 living pinioned fowls, a black cock and a white hen. With a sudden access of bitter fury, he turned on Simon, and seizing him by his silk lapels, shook him as a terrier shakes a rat. You fool! He thundered. I'd rather see you dead than monkeying